Uh, Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Daily Devotional. Our Daily Devotional today is actually going to come from an article that I found. It's kind of a lengthy article. We're not going to read the whole thing. I'll flip over to it in just a second. It was posted a couple of days ago. The title of the article is, "For Some Pastors, the Past Year Was Too Much to Bear." Now, let's get the obvious out of the way first. So, the term pastor is related to the term pastoral. It means to shepherd, to guide, and obviously that term in the New Testament is referred to as elders. There's never just one; it's always more than one. It's two, at least two. So elders are pastors. Pastors are elders. An evangelist can be an elder. There's no rule against it, but not all elders are pastors, but not all evangelists are pastors, I guess is the best way to put it. Generally, in our society, when people refer to pastors, usually they are referring to evangelists. Obviously, in churches that don't regard the scriptures and the authority of the scriptures, you have one person leading a church because they're not interested in having elders, and so they are referred to as a pastor. But just so we know that from a biblical perspective, a pastor is an elder. From society or religious society's perspective, a pastor, usually they mean evangelist or the leader of the church. And that's not the way it's supposed to be, but that's generally what they mean. So just so we get that out of the way. All right, so knowing that, this is an article describing apparently how there's a whole lot of quote-unquote pastors. I'm going to refer to them as evangelists. When I read the article, I'll read pastor, but I'm going to refer to them as evangelists that are quitting. They're quitting their jobs and so forth. And this article kind of delves into why and kind of the situation involved in that. So the article starts, Jeff Weddle, a 46-year-old wisecracking, self-deprecating, Bible-loving, self-described failing pastor from Wisconsin, was already thinking of leaving the ministry before COVID and the 2020 election. He was, as he put it, fed up with church life after 2 decades as a pastor. Then, what he called the stupid, feuds about politics and the pandemic put him over the edge. People at church seemed more concerned about the latest social media dust-up and online conspiracy theories. One church member called him the Antichrist for his views on COVID than learning about the Bible. Sunday mornings had become filled with dread over what could go wrong next. He eventually decided, I don't need this anymore. Weddle stepped down as a pastor, walked out the door, and hasn't looked back. The last 18 months or so have been difficult for pastors like Weddle, already stretched with the day-to-day concerns of running a congregation at a time when organized religion is on the decline. They've increasingly found that the divides facing the nation have made their way inside the walls of the church. Clergy also felt a sense of isolation, cut off from contact with their congregations and unable to do the kind of in-person ministry that drew them to the pastorate. Instead of preaching and visiting the sick, they had become video producers and online content creators. Chuck DeGroat, professor of counseling and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, said pastors have long had to mediate disputes over theology or church practice, like the role of women in the church or the so-called worship wars of recent decades. They now face added stresses from the pandemic and polarization, with people willing to leave their churches over mask policies or discussions of race. So I've highlighted some of the specific things that evangelists are claiming to have issues with. When this individual says worship wars, I'm assuming he's referring to the means by which we worship. Whether or not instrumental music is okay, whether or not all the different types of of ways in which people choose to worship, whether or not it's what the Bible says. But all of these, it's interesting because some of these are, I have heard of situations where some of these situations have kind of come into the Lord's church, into churches of Christ, such as issues about COVID and about politics, about the divides facing the nation, kind of getting inside the church. So I kind of found this article interesting. I'm hearing from pastors that they just don't know what to do. A recent survey of Protestant pastors by the research firm Barna Group found that 29% said they had given real serious consideration to quitting being in full-time ministry within the last year. David Kinnaman, president of Barna, said the past year has been a crucible for pastors. Churches have become fragmented by political and social divides. They have also become frayed as people's connectedness to local congregations is waning. The pandemic was a great revealer of the challenges churches face. Last summer, their council surveyed clergy and found about a quarter said they were considering retiring or leaving the pastorate due to the stresses of ministry during COVID. A recent follow-up survey, said Parker, about a third of respondents said they were considering their options or thinking about leaving. This guy says, unlike natural disasters, you can't just up and leave and go somewhere else because COVID's everywhere. COVID affected everyone, so where do you go? Out of the church. There's several different examples of some of these individuals. The trifecta of the COVID-19 pandemic, the 2020 election, the racial reckoning in response to the death of George Floyd hit like a wrecking ball for this individual. Grace Hills, this is a woman pastor. She talks about the situation that she had. Grace Hill shut down in-person worship at the beginning of the pandemic, which prompted people to leave. More left when the church reopened and required masks. And then when Cox and a black pastor preached a Sunday sermon together after Floyd's death and said that yes, Black Lives Matter, that caused more turmoil. No matter what Cox did, someone was angry. Well, you can say Black Lives Matter without making it political, so I'm not really sure if that was the right way to go about it. I don't know what all that was involved with and how politically charged that lesson was, but regardless, it was sort of relentless, said Cox, who stepped down as pastor at Grace Hill at the end of April. My wife and I just found ourselves in the place of exhaustion. Let's see, this guy's leaving for good because he's going to find a new church to attend, but he's just done with preaching. Okay, that wasn't the woman. This is the woman right here, Emily Reeves. Grammer, who has 2 children, said balancing the demands of ministry and family life proved daunting. And it just goes on and on and on with different examples. Let's see, I think there was one more thing. So before he left the ministry, Weddle began a blog at failingpastor.com detailing some of his concerns about the ministry. Weddle said he gave the ministry his best for 21 years, but being a pastor proved an almost impossible task. Ultimately, you want people to grow in Christ, to be caring, making sense of the Bible, and applying it to their life. And, for thousands of years, it's been very difficult to get people to do that. So the job is inherently frustrating. Leaving the ministry has been a relief. I've been going to church, he wrote recently. I don't have to do anything at a church for the first time in 21 years. I don't have to worry about who isn't there or why or who will be mad next. I don't have to have regrets all afternoon and evening about how I messed up my sermon. So some of this actually hit pretty close to home for me. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to look at this article. Because there are inherent frustrations. There are inherent issues or situations in being an evangelist that can be very difficult to overcome. And I really appreciate the fact that he mentions that, for thousands of years it's been difficult to get people to grow and to learn more about the Bible and so forth. So it's not just COVID. It's not like all of a sudden this has happened. The job itself is inherently difficult. And then you add on top of that the stresses of COVID, the stresses of things that are going on in our nation, things with our government and the politics and so forth. And so when he says, I don't have to do anything at a church for the first time in 21 years. I was kind of thinking about that, and I was doing the math. I started preaching when I was 18, and I started full-time preaching when I was 19, 20. I guess I was, how old was I? It was 2005. So I was 21 when I started full-time preaching. So I've been preaching for 18 years, full-time preaching for 15 years, 16 years. And so I can relate to some of the things that he's saying. Not having to do anything when you go to church, not having to think about, did I do this? Did I do that? Do I have everything together? I don't have to worry about who isn't there or why or who will be mad next. Those are the types of things that in places that I have, at times in places I've been before, there have been issues like that I've had to deal with. Fortunately, I can't remember a time since I've been here in Wichita Falls that I've had that type of problem. But in places that I've been before, at times, especially during certain stretches, there have been times where it was an extremely difficult process. And there were times in the past that I actually did think about just not preaching anymore. In fact, when I moved from South Carolina to San Antonio, it was my intent to not preach for a while and get my degree, and then maybe look into going back into full-time preaching. It didn't happen that way, but and it worked out for the best. But the fact of the matter is, being an evangelist is a difficult process. It's a difficult job. And people who haven't especially been full-time evangelists, I think sometimes, and I think, and the brethren here at Wichita Falls do a wonderful job of kind of understanding and being appreciative of that work. But I think there are times in churches of Christ that I think people don't fully understand or appreciate just how difficult the job can be. And then you add on to that things you got to do for your family, other responsibilities that you have, being on call 24 hours a day, which being on call 24 hours a day isn't a burden, it's simply a fact. And so all of that together is something sometimes I think brethren don't fully appreciate or fully acknowledge and understand. And so little things that really shouldn't upset anybody, sometimes it just, especially without elders, you add into the fact that if you don't have elders, I've never been in a congregation except when I was training that has had elders. And usually elders help provide a buffer, I guess you could say, for the evangelist. Elders a lot of times will help take care of some issues that may crop up from time to time. And it kind of takes some of the need for the preacher or the evangelist to, even though he's not supposed to be, in the absence of elders, sometimes the preacher becomes kind of the face of the congregation or the de facto leader. That's not the way it's supposed to be, but that's sometimes the way it is. And elders can provide kind of a buffer to that. Because they're the leaders. They're the ones that people look to, and the evangelist is just, part of that process of what the elders are doing in spreading the word and doing the job of the church, doing the work of the church. So it's one of those things that this article kind of really hit close to home, and fortunately, I can say that for the last 4 years or so, 5 years that I've been here in Wichita Falls, I don't think I've once thought about stepping away or quit preaching because, it's too difficult or whatnot. And that's a blessing because the brethren here are very understanding, and they're very loving, and they really, I think they understand some of the work that goes into being an evangelist. But having said all of that, I did want to just very quickly touch on what Paul says in Romans chapter 10 and verse 13. Whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. How then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him of whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And so Paul talks about here at the end of Romans 10, the need to preach the gospel, the need to teach to people. How shall they preach unless they are sent, as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the gospel of peace, who bring glad tidings of good things. And there are multiple other places. Paul talks to Timothy, Paul talks to Titus. When Paul tells Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4 to preach the word, be instant in season, out of season, convince, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering. The importance of that is that we need evangelists. And unfortunately, and I don't know if this is COVID, I don't know exactly what some of the background situations or reasons were, but I have heard of preachers of the Church of Christ stepping away, that they're just done. And again, it's been recent. It's been within the last 2 or 3 years. I've heard several examples of that happening. Individuals that I know, and I don't know the specifics. I don't know why they've chosen that. If it was something specific at their congregation, or if it was just something that they'd been thinking about for a while, or if it was COVID or some of the challenges that they were facing. But the need to teach the gospel, the need to have individuals who are willing to devote their lives to teaching the gospel is important. And it's sad that the situation is what it is, where obviously life itself is inherently difficult. The job of an evangelist is inherently difficult. But then when you add to that sometimes brethren who may not be sensitive to that fact, or individuals who sometimes there have been times where it has felt like certain individuals, it's like they just want to make the job more difficult. I don't think that's not their intent, but that sometimes it felt that way in years past, where it's just like their whole job is to make my job harder. And that's sad that that's the case. But having evangelists who are willing to stand for the truth, first of all, to teach the truth no matter what, that's what 2 Timothy chapter 4 is all about, or specifically when he says be instant in season, out of season. That's really important. It's really necessary. And I guess to evangelists and those like me, when we're going through hard times, it's like, who does the preacher talk to? People talk to the preacher, especially without elders. People talk to the preacher. Well, when the preacher has a hard time, who does he talk to? And obviously God is praying about it is a huge thing. My wife, obviously, that's having it's a huge blessing to have her as a helpmate to be able to share those things, and then to have individuals at church to be able to confide in, to ask for advice to individuals who maybe have been there, done that, either as preachers or as elders at one time. Having that background also helps to provide that. But in the end, being an evangelist cannot take precedent over getting to heaven. And this is something that me and other preachers have discussed. It's the fact that sometimes, in order for your own soul, for your own well-being, your own mental or spiritual well-being, sometimes you have to step away. Because again, being an evangelist is a difficult road. And not everybody can do it, first of all, and not everybody can do it for the rest of their entire lives. And that's okay. That's okay. It's sad that the state of society, and sometimes the state of churches of Christ can make that process more difficult. But the fact of the matter is, sometimes you have to choose your own spiritual well-being, your own soul over the job. And that's a very difficult decision. But I don't blame anybody for stepping away. And certainly I don't, it's not shameful to say to yourself, I just can't do it anymore. I'm going to have to find something else to do, because ultimately when I go to church, I can't worship in spirit and in truth because I'm so caught up in the job of an evangelist that I can't worship. And I've had that battle myself. I've had that battle myself at times, especially when there were difficult things going on, where it was a very difficult process to actually focus on my own soul and to worship in spirit and in truth, and not be caught up in everything that was going on as it pertained to my work as an evangelist. And it is a very inherently difficult job. And again, I think that it would be helpful if brethren were a little bit more understanding and thoughtful with regard to the types of things that evangelists face. It might make it a little bit easier for some of my colleagues in the gospel to be able to deal with some things that come up when they have brethren who have their back. All right. That's the daily devotional for you today. I'm sorry I didn't mean for it to be so long, but I feel like this is a very important point that doesn't really get talked about a lot. The type of struggles that evangelists face, the type of thought processes that evangelists goes through their life and through difficult situations, the temptation to walk away, and sometimes the need to walk away just for their own spiritual well-being. That doesn't really get talked about very much. And I think sometimes it can be easy for churches of Christ, for brethren, to take for granted the role of an evangelist, and I think it's important that we don't do that. Of course, I would say that since I'm an evangelist. All right, so that's the daily devotional for you today. Keep in mind, tomorrow being Friday, we'll have our daily devotional at 6:30 once again. So Lord willing, I will see you all tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.